Flaxborough had seen its share of widows, but rarely one who looked so well fed by bereavement. Mrs. Clarice Hudd entered the assembly room of the Methodist Hall with an air of brisk command, her black gloves glinting faintly with patent polish, and her veil, a short symbolic thing, raised before the luncheon began. She did not so much grieve as supervise her loss. The occasion was the annual gathering of the Flaxborough Historical Society, that venerable congregation of amateur antiquarians whose enthusiasm for relics extended at times to one another. Today's luncheon promised a talk entitled The Cast Iron Age Victorian Ornamental Metalwork and Its Preservation, a topic chosen months ago, before fate and gravity had made the subject indecently relevant. At precisely 12:40, as the vicar was balancing a plate of aspic and devotion in one hand, Mrs. Hudd's appearance silenced a murmur that had been in mid-flight between Mrs. Cringe and Miss Mounts, two of the more acoustically gifted gossips in town. Both women watched the widow's progress through the crowd as though a moral experiment were underway. "Brave of her to come," whispered Miss Mounts, meaning the opposite. "Braver to wear grey silk," murmured Mrs. Cringe, meaning exactly that, from his modest seat near the door. Inspector Purbright accepted his cup of tea with the quiet patience of a man often mistaken for the wallpaper. His presence, technically, was civic. He had been invited to represent law and order among those who collected agricultural pamphlets. In practice, he found such events more informative than any formal inquiry. He noted the widow's poise, too serene perhaps, not the watery composure of one newly bereaved, but the calm of someone whose life had resumed its natural rhythm, possibly improved by subtraction. The death of Mr. Arthur Hudd had, for a week, occupied the better class of gossip. The poor man had been found beneath the ornamental iron gate of his own garden, the one he had installed himself, and about which he had spoken with exhausting frequency. It had toppled during a windy night, crushing him instantly. "An accident," said everyone, though in Flaxborough the word accident was usually followed by, for now, Inspector Purbright. The chairman of the Historical Society, a Mr. Shoal, thin, bearded, and faintly sticky, beamed as though the inspector had been summoned for applause. "Your presence honours us. You'll enjoy today's theme, ironwork through the ages." Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed. I've already found it most relevant." Mrs. Hudd, meanwhile, was recounting something to Mrs. Cringe about how her late husband had always insisted on doing things himself. "He wouldn't hear of hiring a workman," she said, her voice brisk but edged. "He had his theories about leverage. I used to say, 'Arthur, one day your principles will drop on you,' and, well," she fluttered a hand. "So they did." There was laughter. Polite, brittle laughter. The kind one gives when unsure whether tragedy has been reclassified as anecdote. Purbright caught the remark without appearing to. He sipped his tea, his gaze on the biscuit tray. Words, he thought, often weighed more than evidence, especially when chosen by people unused to weighing them at all. Later, as the lecture began, delivered by a man whose moustache seemed to take notes independently, Purbright observed the widow again. She smiled at intervals not corresponding to the speaker's jokes. Her hand toyed with a brooch shaped like a coiled serpent. Iron, if he was not mistaken, though burnished to a deceptive gleam. When the talk ended, applause rustled like dry leaves. Mrs. Hudd was among the first to rise, thanking everyone in a tone that sounded rehearsed, for sympathy, but produced admiration instead. Outside, the afternoon light slanted across Market Hill, catching the widow's veil like smoke. Purbright emerged a few steps behind her and found himself beside the society's secretary, Miss Pulteney, a woman whose life was ruled by minutes and minutes by lists. "She's bearing up marvellously, don't you think?" Miss Pulteney said, fastening her handbag with precision. "Of course, she's practical, always has been. I suppose when you've been married to an engineer—" "Engineer?" Purbright's tone was mild curiosity. "Oh, not by profession," Miss Pulteney said quickly, as though defending a detail. "By disposition. Mr. Hudd built all sorts of contraptions. A water feature, a bird table that rotated to follow the sun, though it usually followed Mrs. Hudd's washing line instead." "I see," said Purbright, and he did, though only faintly, like a shape behind frosted glass. As he turned toward the police station, a phrase from the luncheon returned to him. "Arthur, one day your principles will drop on you." Delivered lightly, yes, but with the practiced rhythm of something said more than once. He tucked that away, mentally. Beside another fact, the iron gate had been freshly painted a week before it fell, and Purbright, being Purbright, smiled almost imperceptibly, the way a man does when he's heard the first line of a story whose ending he intends to write himself. By the following morning, Mrs. Hudd's luncheon appearance had achieved the rare Flaxborough distinction of being discussed in every establishment that sold anything, brewed anything, or permitted sitting. It was said that by 10:30 the widow's grey silk had been mentioned at least 40 times, her brooch 15, and her manner, indescribable though it was, by everyone at the post office. Miss Peebles leaned confidentially across the counter to Mrs. Cringe, who was purchasing stamps but not intending to post anything. "Of course," said Miss Peebles, lowering her voice, though no one was listening. She laughed. You could hear it right over the aspic. "That's not grief, that's relief," Mrs. Cringe sighed through her nose. "She's a woman who knows how to move on. Arthur Hudd never did let her spend a sixpence without an invoice." Meanwhile, at the bar of the Bull, Mr. Hargreaves, who sold agricultural machinery and opinions in equal quantity, had produced what he termed a practical explanation. "That gate," he declared, tapping his pint for emphasis, "was top-heavy. You put too much fancy iron at the top and she'll come down sooner or later. He was daft to stand under it." Mind you, some reckon he weren't under it till someone put him there. A small silence followed this suggestion, in which every man regarded his beer as if seeking corroboration within. Then Mr. Dingle, who liked the sound of agreement, muttered, "Aye, you never know, do you?" And thus the idea began its tour of the town. Inspector Purbright, by that hour, was at his desk, applying himself to the least diverting of police labours, expense returns. His sergeant, Love, entered with the sort of expression that promised information but demanded patience. "Bit of chatter about Mrs. Hudd this morning, sir?" "I should think so," said Purbright mildly, without looking up. "If she'd failed to provide any, they'd have invented it for her." Love hesitated. "Only someone said, at the Bull, I believe, that the gate might have been—" "Interfered with." Purbright's pencil paused. "Interfered with?" "Yes, sir. A screw missing, or loosened deliberate-like. Course that's pub talk." "All talk begins in a pub, Love," Purbright said, signing another form. "It's only the truth that rarely stays long enough to settle the bill." He set the pencil aside and leaned back. "Still keep an ear open. The tone of gossip is often more revealing than its content. Out in the town, the tone was indeed changing. What had been an unfortunate mishap the day before was now a very strange business. At Tegg and Croom, the insurance office where neatness was regarded as a moral duty, the clerks were whispering over a file marked Hudd. "Arthur J. policy renewed only a fortnight before," murmured one clerk, whose spectacles reflected righteousness. "Accidental death clause? Quite generous." In the bakery queue, Mrs. Cringe reappeared, gossip having expanded her errands. "They say she's smiling again," she told Miss Mounts, "and only a week since it happened." "Shock, dear," said Miss Mounts knowingly. "Some people go into it, others out of it, and Clarice Hudd was always one for coming out of things looking better." By mid-afternoon, the vicar's wife had developed a firm theological position on the matter, namely, that Mrs. Hudd's composure was proof of deep faith. This theory reached the butcher by closing time, slightly modified into evidence of foreign blood. At the police station, Purbright stood by the window, watching a small procession of townspeople making their way home under a pale drizzle. He could almost hear the rumours forming as they moved. Each word carried a hint of envy, each suspicion a touch of satisfaction. He turned as Sergeant Love returned. "Bit more, sir," said Love. Mrs. Cringe told Miss Mounts that Mrs. Hudd said she was thinking of starting afresh. Miss Mounts said she said it with a smile. Purbright raised an eyebrow. "A smile? Dangerous thing in Flaxborough, Love. It's taken as either confession or conspiracy." He returned to his paperwork, but spoke after a pause. "Did the constable check the Hudd property yet?" "Constable Trimble did, sir." "Nothing out of place." "Except, well, he said one side of the gate hinge looked newer than the other." Purbright nodded slowly. "Fresh paint does tend to conceal more than rust." Love looked puzzled. "You think it was tampered with?" "I think," said Purbright, "that people who dislike their circumstances sometimes find ways to make gravity an accomplice." He left it at that, his tone too even for speculation. Outside, the church bell marked 5 o'clock, and the drizzle turned to rain, the sort that seemed to wash nothing clean. Mrs. Hudd, walking briskly along the high street under a large umbrella, nodded to acquaintances and accepted their condolences with an efficiency bordering on charm. Her morning attire, neat and faintly stylish, drew approving looks from some, scandalized tuts from others. At the corner, she paused outside the ironmonger's shop. Its window display featured locks, bolts, and tins of enamel paint. For a moment she stood gazing at the shelves, her reflection merging with the rows of metallic objects. Then she moved on, leaving the shopkeeper frowning faintly after her. By the time she reached home, the lamps along her street were glowing softly. She paused by the gate, its twin hinges freshly coated and gleaming even in the dim light, and touched the cold metal with her gloved hand, as though testing whether it remembered. A curtain twitched from across the street. Mrs. Cringe, naturally. Inside, the widow closed the door with a measured sigh and switched on a single lamp. The sitting room was neat to the point of impersonality. Only the faint smell of iron polish lingered. On the mantelpiece stood a small, framed photograph of her late husband, smiling as though someone had told him a secret just before the picture was taken. She regarded it for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned away, poured herself a modest glass of sherry, and murmured, almost cheerfully, "To Arthur." Across town, Purbright was locking his office. "Love," he said as they stepped out into the wet street, "observe tomorrow how fast sympathy evaporates when mixed with suspicion. I expect by Tuesday the widow will be guilty of something. Perhaps even the truth." Love smiled uncertainly. "You don't think she did, sir?" Purbright gave a small, polite shrug. "Oh, Love, in Flaxborough, innocence is usually just guilt that hasn't learned to tidy up." They walked on, their reflections wavering beside them in the puddled pavement, while somewhere behind, lace curtains. The town continued its evening occupation, deciding what sort of widow Mrs. Hudd ought to be. By Monday morning, the drizzle had settled into the sort of rain that seemed to have made up its mind to stay. Inspector Purbright, impervious beneath a dark umbrella and mild curiosity, walked the short distance from the station to Mulberry Lane. The Hudd residence, a square red-brick villa with ideas above its frontage, looked precisely as it ought, neat, respectable, and faintly smug about it. Only the garden gate, its iron freshly gleaming, betrayed any hint of recent drama. Mrs. Hudd greeted him in a tone perfectly balanced between gratitude and inconvenience. "Inspector, of course." "Do come in. Mind the rug, it's new." The sitting room smelled faintly of lavender polish and faintly of something sterner. Enamel paint, perhaps. She gestured him toward a chair and sat opposite, hands folded with the composure of one being interviewed for a magazine feature rather than a police inquiry. "I hope this isn't formal," she began, smiling carefully. "Merely routine," Purbright assured her. "You understand how it is after an accident. There are small details to be settled, times, places, recollections." "Oh, quite." She gave a brisk nod. "I've gone over it in my mind, of course. I told Arthur to have that gate looked at. He insisted he'd done it himself, Something about reinforcing the hinge. Always thought he knew better than the tradesman. Purbright's gaze moved briefly to the window, where the garden was visible in soft focus through rain-streaked glass. You mentioned at the luncheon that your husband was fond of constructing things. Her eyes flickered with a quick amusement. Constructing and collapsing, Inspector. He had the temperament of an inventor and the luck of a poet. I always said one day his enthusiasm would kill him. He inclined his head slightly. And you were home that evening? I was. In bed by 10, though I couldn't sleep. I heard a noise around past. I thought it was the wind. I suppose it was the gate. She sipped her tea with admirable steadiness. When I found him in the morning, I called Dr. Fitch straight away. Indeed. Purbright's tone was even almost gentle. Did you notice anything unusual? Tools left out, for instance? Her eyes narrowed a fraction, then relaxed. No, nothing of that sort. Arthur was particular about tidiness in the shed. He always put things away. Yes, said Purbright. I've found that tidy men leave remarkably disorderly deaths. He smiled, as if it were a joke. She didn't return it. He left shortly after, exchanging polite thanks, and walked the short path to the gate. The iron gleamed wetly. The hinges bore an almost new metallic lustre. Purbright bent, peering at the lower hinge. The paint was slightly bubbled as though applied in haste. He touched it with a gloved finger, tackier than it should have been after a week. Across the street, a curtain rippled, Mrs. Cringe naturally emerging just as he straightened. Oh, Inspector, you're looking into poor Arthur's accident, are you? She stepped out with the cautious eagerness of one aware her information was valuable, but her source indefensible. Terrible business, of course. Though some say not entirely accident if you take my meaning. Purbright's expression was one of polite absorption. Do tell me what some say. Well, she said, lowering her voice as though confiding national secrets. The very evening before it happened, she, Mrs. Hudd that is, was seen at the hardware shop. Buying paint and something else, one of those little bottles, you know, for cleaning metal. Solvent? That's it. My cousin works there. Says she asked for the strongest kind. Helpful of your cousin to remember. Oh, we all try to do our part, Mrs. Cringe said, missing the tone entirely. Mind you, Clarice always liked things shiny, especially when someone was coming round. Purbright thanked her with such courtesy that she failed to notice the irony and returned indoors feeling profoundly useful. Later that day, he called on Mr. Leaper, the undertaker, who met him in the sombreness of black serge and sincerity. A straightforward case, Inspector, said Leaper, ushering him into the embalming room, which smelled faintly of lilies and linoleum. Though I did remark to Dr. Fitch, the bruising on the shoulder looked heavier than one would expect from the gait alone. Still, I dare say I'm no judge of such things. Purbright nodded thoughtfully. You've seen a fair share of unfortunate arrangements, Mr. Leaper. Any intuition about this one? The undertaker looked pleased. Only that the late Mr. Hudd struck me as a man more likely to oil a hinge than leave it loose. I recall him once lecturing me at the Mechanics' Institute about torsional stress. I dare say his wife's nerves were the only things he never over-tightened. When Purbright returned to the station, Sergeant Love was waiting with the expression of a man trying to hold too many facts and too few certainties. So you'll want to know, Miss Teatime called. Said she'd seen Mrs. Hudd buying solvent too at Evans's shop 2 days before the accident. Indeed? A popular recollection. Yes, sir. And the constable at the chemist's says she was in asking for something to take paint off iron railings. Said it was for her husband's project. Purbright leaned back, steepling his fingers. Curious, isn't it, love? Paint applied one day, dissolved the next. The ironwork seems to have been receiving more attention than affection. Love frowned. Do you think she meant to? I think, said Purbright mildly, that purpose in such cases is usually the last thing one applies and the first thing that flakes away. He rose, glancing at the rain outside. Let's not decide too soon. Flaxborough dislikes ambiguity. It tends to tidy it up before it's finished talking. We'll allow it a few more days. That evening, as the inspector walked home through the drizzle, The lamps cast blurred halos in the puddles. Somewhere behind lace curtains, someone was no doubt repeating Mrs. Cringe's story, improved and repainted for its next listener. He thought again of the widow's phrase at the luncheon. "Arthur, one day your principles will drop on you." Perhaps, he reflected, they already had. Only it might not have been gravity that helped them fall. By Wednesday, the case of the late Mr. Hudd had begun to show signs of settling, at least in the tidy minds of those who disliked uncertainty. The coroner's preliminary findings, read aloud with bureaucratic solemnity, leaned firmly toward accidental misfortune. The local councillor, Mr. Harcourt Bell, went further, declaring it a tragic but entirely foreseeable event in a household overly fond of do-it-yourself. Such pronouncements had a comforting effect on Flaxborough. They suggested the world still functioned according to a polite logic. Meddlesome husbands were punished by physics, widows by sympathy, and the town by the necessity of discussing it all. Inspector Purbright, however, found the comfort oddly hollow. He sat through the brief inquest in the town hall, quietly listening as witnesses repeated their lines with practiced finality. Mrs. Hudd, in restrained black and a veil of respectable brevity, confirmed that her husband had been fiddling with the gate hinges earlier that week. Her tone suggested an affectionate exasperation, the sort reserved for the mechanically overconfident. When asked whether she had noticed anything amiss that evening, she shook her head. Nothing beyond the usual. Arthur was proud of that gate, always polishing and repainting it. "I sometimes said he'd rather lose me than the thing, and, well, he's managed both now." A few of the assembled citizens smiled uncertainly. The coroner, misinterpreting composure for virtue, nodded approvingly and delivered his verdict. Accidental death. No further action required. Afterwards, in the drizzle outside, Councillor Harcourt Bell clapped Purbright's shoulder with an air of benevolent closure. "Sensible result, Inspector? These things happen. Man tinkers with what he doesn't understand. Nature obliges him with a demonstration." Purbright's answering smile was courteous but faint. "Quite. Gravity rarely objects to cooperation." He watched the councillor depart, then turned his gaze toward the widow, who was accepting condolences with practiced gentility. Her eyes met his briefly, neither defiant nor grateful, simply measuring. She inclined her head, then moved toward a waiting car. "Open and shut case, sir?" Sergeant Love asked later when they returned to the station. "Almost too open," Purbright replied. "And rather neatly shut," Love frowned. "Everything fits, though." She was in bed. He was out in the garden. No sign of interference, no proof of tampering. Purbright regarded him mildly. "Proof and truth are rarely housemates, Love. One keeps the place tidy for the other's occasional visit." He set aside the report and opened the small envelope that had arrived earlier that morning. Inside was a photograph taken by the constable after the accident. It showed the gate where it had fallen. Iron scrollwork sprawled across the path, one hinge torn clean. At first glance unremarkable, but Purbright's eyes lingered on the faint smear near the lower bar, a line of pale residue, paint, and something darker beneath. That afternoon he paid a brief visit to Dr. Fitch, the town's physician, whose opinions were as compact as his handwriting. "Natural causes, Inspector," the doctor declared. "Crushed windpipe, instantaneous. I doubt the poor fellow had time to think, which is merciful. Did you notice anything unusual about the injuries?" Fitch adjusted his spectacles. "Apart from the obvious? Some bruising about the shoulder. Perhaps he tried to push the gate away as it fell. Not uncommon in accidents. Reflexes are tragically optimistic things, quite." Purbright thanked him, pocketing the note. He did not mention the undertaker's observation of the same bruises. Two men of such differing trades agreeing by accident was, in his experience, improbable. On his way back, Purbright stopped at the hardware shop, where Mr. Evans was polishing a display of padlocks with religious concentration. "Afternoon, Mr. Evans."
You had a visit from Mrs. Hudd before her husband's accident, I believe?
Evans nodded slowly. Yes, sir.
About a week before, I'd say.
She wanted paint, dark green, same as before.
And something to clean metal.
Said her husband had left the gate in a state and she was tidying it up for him. Purbright glanced at the tins lined neatly behind the counter. Did she specify what kind of cleaner?
Asked for something that would loosen old paint.
I told her to try this new solvent. Works wonders, though you've to be careful not to thin the metal under it. Eats rust as well as conscience. The inspector smiled faintly.
Did she seem in a hurry? Not so much hurry as
satisfaction, sir. Said she was putting things in order. I took it to mean the garden. Purbright thanked him and left. Outside, the rain had thinned to a pale mist, enough to blur the outlines of the street. The town, in its reassuring dullness, gave nothing away. Its secrets moved like minnows beneath the surface. At the police station, Love was reading the evening paper aloud, a habit born of optimism. Coroner rules accidental death, Mrs. Hudd praised for fortitude, and the council's thinking of a memorial garden gate at the Mechanics' Institute. How very apt, said Purbright. They might even let her unveil it. Love looked uncertain whether this was humour.
Do you think it's really settled, sir?
Purbright leaned back, studying the smoke curling from his pipe. The law likes convenience, Love. So does human nature. But I've found that when both agree too quickly, something untidy is hiding underneath. He opened his notebook and made a single notation. Paint, solvent, bruise, new hinge. Then closed it with a soft click, as though not to disturb a thought still forming. Outside, the lamps flickered on across Market Hill. In the distance, the church clock struck 6. Somewhere among the neat rows of Flaxborough's homes, a widow poured herself another small sherry and smiled at her reflection, wondering, perhaps with a hint of triumph, how swiftly the world restored itself when one provided it with a convenient explanation. Purbright, meanwhile, sat alone in the quiet office. The faint sound of rain against the window. His gaze drifted toward the photograph once more. The fallen gate. The faint trace of paint, the sort of detail everyone else had overlooked precisely because it was so ordinary. He smiled slightly. Ordinary things, he thought, were the best hiding places for extraordinary intentions. By Thursday morning, the town had begun to tire of the Hudd affair. The gossip, having exhausted invention, was settling into repetition. People no longer whispered in curiosity but in confirmation. The widow's composure had now been reclassified as admirable and her husband's fate as regrettable but
educational. Only Inspector Purbright appeared,
unsatisfied with the tidy ending that everyone else had embraced. He was in the station's small evidence room, studying the photograph of the fallen gate once again, when Sergeant Love entered with a bundle of maintenance receipts. Found these in Mr. Hudd's desk drawer, sir. Seems he kept every invoice since 1958, even one for a tin of polish. Purbright smiled faintly. A man who believed in permanence, then.
Until permanence disagreed, he turned one receipt over. Paint, hinge bolts, varnish.
All purchased 3 weeks before his death. Love looked puzzled. But the paint on the gate, wasn't that new?
Very new, Purbright said, examining the photograph.
So new it still hadn't hardened by the night it fell. Yet this receipt shows the job was done long before. He set the paper down and tapped his pipe thoughtfully. Either Mr. Hudd enjoyed repainting the same thing twice in a month, or someone else repainted it later. Love frowned.
His wife? Possibly.
The solvent she bought would have stripped the old coat easily enough. But why repaint something you intend to leave looking natural?
Unless, of course, the new coat had another purpose. Love considered this uneasily.
To cover marks, you mean?
Well, perhaps.
Or to hide the absence of them. That afternoon, Purbright walked once more to Mulberry Lane. The rain had ceased, leaving the pavements washed and glistening. Mrs. Hudd's house stood immaculate as ever, the sort of home that looked as though it vacuumed itself when left alone. She opened the door at once as if she'd been expecting him. Inspector, how very punctual of you. I'm afraid I've developed a habit of it, he replied mildly. May I trouble you again, just for a few questions about the garden gate?
Of course, she said, with what sounded like weary indulgence.
Though I thought that was all concluded. Almost, he agreed. I just like to be thorough. I find small details have an unhelpful tendency to change their minds. She led him into the garden, where the repaired gate now stood upright again, freshly oiled and gleaming.
I had the blacksmith rehang it, she said.
Couldn't bear to see it lying there. Purbright nodded, bending slightly to inspect the lower hinge. A fine job. Though I noticed the paint colour differs slightly from the fence. Oh? I hadn't noticed. Most wouldn't. This shade is called verdigris moss. The older one was hunter's green, only noticeable in bright light. She smiled, though a touch delayed. You've a very good eye, Inspector. An occupational handicap, he said pleasantly.
I wonder, Mrs. Hudd, did your husband repaint it himself?
Yes, I believe so. Strange, he murmured, straightening. The brush mark suggests smaller strokes, more patient, more deliberate than a man's hand. And forgive me, rather neater. Her lips parted slightly, but she recovered almost at once. He was careful, meticulous. I'm sure he was. Purbright smiled, then pointed to the corner of the garden where a collection of flower pots stood. Your husband's shed? Locked, I assume?
Yes, I haven't gone in there since. Quite understandable, may I?
She hesitated, but fetched the key from the kitchen without comment.
Inside, the shed smelled of rust, turpentine, and something sharp. Chemical, faintly acrid.
Tools hung with soldierly precision. On the bench, a small patch of bare wood gleamed lighter than the rest, as though something had been recently moved. Purbright touched it, then looked beneath the bench. A tin of paint remover lay there, its label half peeled, cap unscrewed. He closed the door softly and rejoined her outside. A thorough husband indeed, he said.
Did you happen to repaint the gate after the accident?
Perhaps as a way of tidying things. Her eyes flicked toward him and away again. No, I couldn't bear to touch it. Ah, Purbright's tone was almost apologetic. Then it must have been done by kindness.
People can be surprisingly helpful after a tragedy. She said nothing.
He thanked her for her time and departed, walking slowly toward Market Hill. The air smelled faintly metallic, as though the town itself were rusting gently in the damp. Back at the station, Love was waiting. We had a call from the blacksmith, sir, Mr. Jupp. He said Mrs. Hudd brought the gate in for repair the day after the inquest. Wanted it rehung immediately, Purbright nodded, eager to restore normality.
And what else?
Well, Jupp said the paint was still sticky when he handled it. Said it looked fresh. Too fresh for something supposedly painted weeks before the accident. Indeed. Purbright lit his pipe and leaned back. She told me the same story as before, only smoother this time. But the truth has texture, Love. You can feel it when someone sands it down too carefully. Love looked thoughtful. So she painted it after it fell? That's odd. Very. Particularly if one's reason for repainting is to disguise what the old surface might have shown. Scratches, tool marks, solvent residue. Love hesitated. You think she planned it? I think she prepared it, Purbright said quietly. The difference lies only in confidence. Outside, the town clock struck 8, its sound muffled in the damp air. Through the office window, the inspector watched the faint mist rise from the cobbles. In Flaxborough, he reflected, the extraordinary always wore ordinary clothes, a fresh coat of paint, a proper smile, a tidy explanation, and beneath them all, the same trivial but persistent oddity that betrayed human nature at work. He made a note in his book: color variance, new paint, solvent smell, timing incongruent, then closed it, slowly, as though sealing something fragile. Somewhere across town, Mrs. Hudd poured her evening sherry and drew the curtains. For a moment she stood motionless, listening to the faint creak of the garden gate in the breeze. Then, with a small, decisive movement, she latched the window firmly and twice. That night, Inspector Purbright sat in his small office. the photograph of the fallen gate lying on his desk beneath a pool of lamplight. The faint residue beneath the hinge still drew his attention. That thin, almost imperceptible line of pale green that didn't belong. It was the sort of detail no one else would have noticed, or if they had, would have dismissed as ordinary. But Purbright's interest, cultivated by years of politely doubting everything, was piqued by the ordinary. He leaned back, fingers steepled. "Hunter's green," he murmured softly to himself. Then he turned to the photograph of the repaired gate, freshly taken by Sergeant Love that morning. This one gleamed a different shade entirely. Softer, more artificial, like something meant to deceive the eye rather than please it. It wasn't the color itself that troubled him. It was its freshness. Paint was meant to preserve, to protect, to last. Repainting so soon after tragedy, that suggested more than sentimentality. When Love entered with the day's reports, Purbright didn't immediately look up. "Love," he said at length, "you have a tidy sort of mind. Suppose you were to repaint something you didn't wish others to notice. What might that be?"
Love blinked.
"You mean, sir, like scratches?" "Scratches, dents, marks of interference." He rose, stretching, and reached for his coat. "A murderer may fail to hide a body, Love, but he will always hide his handiwork." They left the station together, heading down toward Mulberry Lane. The evening was cool and faintly scented with coal smoke. As they passed the corner shop, the proprietor nodded deferentially, as people often did when the police were not strictly expected, but not entirely unwelcome either. When they reached the Hud residence, it was dark save for a single light in the parlour. Purbright paused by the garden gate. It looked immaculate once more, newly painted, precisely hung, shining faintly in the lamplight like something proud of itself. He touched one of the hinges lightly with his finger, then sniffed it. "Still tacky," he said. Love frowned. "But she told us the blacksmith rehung it over a week ago." "Indeed? And I suppose he varnished it every evening since, purely for the pleasure of repetition." From the front room came a faint shadow, the silhouette of Mrs. Hud, moving past the window, graceful, unhurried. Purbright straightened. "We won't disturb her this time. Curiosity, Love, is best served unannounced." They turned away, but Purbright stopped again a few steps down the street. His eyes drifted toward the opposite pavement, where Mrs. Cringe's curtains shifted with suspicious punctuality. He gave a faint smile.
"Come along," he said.
"If the widow's gate has no voice, Mrs. Cringe will supply one." Inside her sitting room, the air was warm and faintly perfumed, with something intended to smell like roses, but achieved only effort. Mrs. Cringe greeted them with flustered importance.
Visibly thrilled at being consulted. "Oh,
"Inspector," I said to myself, "you'd be round again. There's always something with these things, isn't there?" "Only the truth, Mrs. Cringe," said Purbright, with a tone that managed to sound both courteous and weary. "You've been observing Mrs. Hud's house, I take it?" "Not observing, Inspector, but noticing. I'm not one to pry, but one does notice when people behave strangely." "And how has she behaved?" Mrs. Cringe leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, 2 nights ago, after dark, mind you, she was out there with a lantern, fussing about the gate."
Couldn't see what she was doing exactly, but there was a sort of scraping sound. "Like polishing or sanding." "Sanding," Purbright repeated softly.
"You're certain?" "Quite. And then the very next morning she brought it to the blacksmith. I told my cousin straight away. She said it's not natural for a woman to fuss over iron at midnight." "Your cousin is unusually observant," Purbright murmured. After the usual civilities, they took their leave, and as they stepped into the cool night air, Love exhaled.
"Midnight sanding, sir? That's not grief." "No," Purbright agreed.
"That's anxiety." He looked back toward the house, where the light in the windows still burned, steady and low. "There's something she's smoothing out, Love. Not just paint. Perhaps conscience. Perhaps something far more tangible." They walked on in silence until they reached the market square. The clock struck 9, the sound thin and hollow through the damp air. Purbright paused beneath the archway of the post office. "Do you recall what Mrs. Cringe told us about the solvent?" he asked. "Yes, sir," said she bought the strongest sort. "And that, love, dissolves not only paint, but iron oxide, rust." A little too enthusiastically, in fact. Love frowned.
"You mean it could have weakened the gate?"
"Precisely. A gentle weakening concealed beneath a handsome new coat of paint, just enough for the hinge to fail, when gravity had an accomplice." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Love said quietly, "You think she meant to do it?" Purbright's answer came slowly.
"I think Mrs. Hudd is a woman who dislikes chaos."
"And sometimes, love, people remove the source of chaos the way they remove a stain, carefully and with a good solvent." Back in his office later that night, Purbright wrote a short note in his book. Sanding, solvent, late-night work, paint discrepancy. He closed it gently, as one might a file containing something still incomplete. Then he turned off the lamp, pausing for a moment in the darkness. Across the town, under a dim light in her parlour, Mrs. Hudd sat by the fire, her gloved hands folded on her lap. On the table beside her lay a small tin of paint, its lid firmly sealed, its label barely legible from overuse. She gazed at it a long while, her expression neither remorseful nor triumphant, merely reflective. Then, with a delicate movement, she placed the tin inside a drawer and locked it. Outside, the gate creaked faintly in the night breeze, a soft, metallic sigh that carried across the quiet street.
As though the iron itself remembered more than it should. By Friday.
Flaxborough's interest in the Hudd affair had begun to mutate again, from scandal to speculation, and from speculation to entertainment. Where the inquest had ended the story, gossip had begun the sequel. Every conversation in town now contained a quiet, confidential phrase like, "Of course, between ourselves," or "not that I'm suggesting anything." Even Mrs. Cringe, who had once declared the widow entirely innocent, now spoke with the gravity of one who had discovered sin behind lace curtains. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, had begun to feel the shape of something larger forming beneath the polite surface of events. A network of small, unspoken connections that towns like Flaxborough seemed to grow naturally, like ivy over old brick. He spent the morning reviewing the late Mr. Hudd's life, or rather, the fragments of it that survived in public record and private recollection. The man had been a retired draftsman, precise in manner and solitary in habit. He'd once partnered with a Mr. Granby in a modest engineering firm that had dissolved amicably 2 years prior. The word amicably, Purbright knew, was usually a courtesy applied where truth might embarrass. By noon, he was sitting opposite Mr. Granby in the back office of a machinery supplier near the railway yard. Granby was a thick-set man whose eyebrows seemed to conspire with his moustache against the rest of his face. "Hudd," he said, frowning.
"A good worker."
"Clever but stubborn. Never happy unless he was right. Which he usually was, damn him. We fell out over a patent. He wanted to sell it.
I wanted to keep it."
He said I'd no imagination.
"I said he'd too much." Purbright's expression conveyed mild sympathy and exact curiosity. "A patent for what, Mr. Granby?"
Some sort of adjustable bracket for gate hinges.
"Ironwork, mostly."
He'd been experimenting for years. Half the reason his own gate was such a contraption. You could swing it either way, apparently. Not that it did him much good in the end. Did you ever resolve the dispute? Granby gave a shrug that hinted at bitterness long congealed. He took the design papers with him when he retired. Said he'd make something of it himself. That was the last I heard, until his accident. And the patent, it was never filed? Not to my knowledge. When Purbright left, the afternoon had turned pale and thin. He walked past the railway line where freight trains clanked idly in the sidings, and thought about Granby's words. A gate hinge, adjustable and sturdy. Perhaps that was what Hudd had been building the week he died. or what someone else wanted him not to finish. Back at the station, Sergeant Love was waiting with an envelope and a self-satisfied expression. "Report from the insurance office, sir." "You were right to ask. Policy renewed 3 weeks before the accident, and with a substantial increase in coverage. Mrs. Hudd named sole beneficiary." "Ah," said Purbright quietly. "There's nothing like sudden mortality to make insurance men brisk." Love cleared his throat. "And there's something else. The adjuster, fellow called Tegg, says Mrs. Hudd's been asking when the payout will be processed. Says she's hoping to travel." "Travel?" "Yes, sir. Bournemouth first, then perhaps abroad." "She sounded cheerful about it," Purbright smiled faintly. "Flaxborough widows, Love, often find cheer in geographical therapy. It's the one form of escape no one considers improper." He tapped the envelope thoughtfully. "Mr. Tegg, you say? Let's have a word with him." Mr. Tegg proved to be a small, exacting man whose devotion to paperwork bordered on the spiritual. He welcomed Purbright into his office with the air of a man who believed crime was an inefficiency rather than a sin. Yes, Inspector, most unfortunate business. I've been handling the claim personally. Everything quite in order, naturally, except for a small delay while we confirm the exact cause of death." "Do you often find cause of death affects the paperwork?" Purbright asked mildly. Tegg adjusted his spectacles. "Well, one doesn't wish to pay out for, shall we say, deliberate self-endangerment. Though, of course, Mrs. Hudd seems entirely above reproach."
A very capable woman.
"Knows her documents, almost."
Professional. Professional? In her manner, said Tegg with a nervous smile.
"Efficient. When she came in to sign the forms, she even reminded me to check the double indemnity clause."
"Not everyone reads those, you know." "Few do," said Purbright.
"Except those who have cause to." He thanked the man and left. Outside, the late afternoon sun had broken weakly through the clouds, turning the puddles in Market Hill to sheets of pale gold. Purbright walked slowly toward the church, where the sexton was trimming hedges with grim determination. "Afternoon, Mr. Purbright," the man said. "You'll be here about the widow again, I suppose?" "I am," Purbright admitted. "You've seen her recently?" "Oh, aye, comes most days, puts flowers on his grave, but that never stays long, 5 minutes at most. Yesterday, she stood there talking to herself as if explaining something.
Then she laughed. Laughed?
Aye, not loud, mind you. Just one of them short laughs people make when they work something out." When Purbright returned to the station, he found Miss Teatime waiting in the foyer, her hat at a bold angle and her expression suggesting a secret not yet volunteered. "I thought you'd like to know," she said archly. "Our dear Mrs. Hudd has been seeing rather a lot of the insurance man. Mr. Tegg, 2 teas this week and what looked suspiciously like supper last night. My hairdresser's niece saw them." Purbright inclined his head. "You do keep the town well informed, Miss Teatime." "I regard it as public service," she said sweetly. "Besides, one ought to know what widows are insuring these days." When she left, Love looked uneasy.
"You think she and Tegg are—"
"I think," said Purbright, "that grief often seeks company, and company sometimes seeks profit.
Either way, love, the field is widening."
There are more players on this lawn than the town supposes." He turned to the window, where dusk was creeping up the edges of the square. "Let's see where this game leads before we tidy it away." Outside, the first street lamps flickered to life. In one of the upper windows across from the police station, a figure moved, perhaps Mrs. Cringe, perhaps someone else, drawing a curtain just as the inspector looked up. Flaxborough, in its usual way, was settling for the night, comfortably ignorant of the quiet complications taking root among its residents. But Purbright, standing there with his pipe unlit, could already sense that the calm was too deliberate, the explanations too neat, somewhere between a patent, a policy, and a pair of freshly painted hinges. A small truth was waiting, and he had the distinct feeling it would not stay buried for long. The weekend began in Flaxborough with a sense of restored order. The sun reappeared timidly after days of drizzle, drying the cobbles and brightening the window boxes along Market Hill. Even Mrs. Cringe declared that everything seemed to be settling again. But the town's calm, like its morality, was more decorative than durable. By Sunday morning, that calm was quietly and efficiently dismantled. Purbright was woken early by a call from Sergeant Love, whose tone suggested the day would not proceed peacefully. "Another business at the Hud House, sir. Someone's broken in." By the time Purbright arrived, the street was already alive with speculation disguised as sympathy. A small cluster of neighbours had gathered outside the widow's gate, whispering with the solemn curiosity of those attending a second funeral. The gate itself stood half open, its fresh paint glistening under the morning sun. Mrs. Hud met the inspector at the door, pale but composed in a housecoat of unassailable neatness.
"Inspector," she said, "it's dreadful, simply dreadful."
"I came down this morning to find the study in complete disarray. Drawers pulled out, papers everywhere. Was anything taken?"
I'm not sure."
"It all looks so violated." She gestured toward the small room off the hall. Inside, the disarray was precise. A single desk drawer overturned, several envelopes torn open, and a faint smell of cold iron lingering in the air. Purbright bent to pick up one of the papers. "Your husband's handwriting?" "Yes, notes from his engineering work."
"I kept them all for sentiment's sake, of course," Purbright said softly.
"And did your husband keep a safe?" She hesitated. "Small one, yes, behind that cabinet."
"But it's empty now. Empty before the burglary.
"Don't recall." Love, meanwhile, had been examining the window. "No sign of forced entry, sir." Latch opened neatly, almost as if from inside. Purbright's gaze drifted to the hearth. On the mantel lay a small brass frame, the photograph of the late Mr. Hud, now cracked across the corner. He reached out and adjusted it slightly. "Sometimes," he murmured, "people return not for what's missing, but for what they left behind." Mrs. Hud looked bewildered.
"I beg your pardon?"
"Nothing, Mrs. Hud. Just an old policeman's superstition." He examined the desk again. Among the scattered papers was a small torn scrap bearing part of a letterhead. Tegg and Croom, Insurance and Assurance Agents. He slipped it discreetly into his pocket. "You'll stay elsewhere tonight, I imagine?" "Yes, I've arranged to stay with a friend, Miss Larch." Out on the high road, prudent, he gave her a reassuring nod, though his eyes lingered a fraction too long on the untouched glass of sherry beside the desk. Faintly dusty, suggesting it had been poured, but never drunk. By late afternoon, the burglary was already reshaping itself in the public imagination. At the Bull, it was confidently stated that thieves had stolen a fortune in jewels. At the post office, they were sure the culprit was a vagrant from the railway, and by the time the tale reached Mrs. Cringe's drawing room, it had evolved into something positively biblical. "Retribution, that's what it is," she told Miss Mounts. "The law doesn't let iron gates and broken safes go unconnected." Purbright, for his part, was less convinced by divine symmetry. He spent the afternoon at the insurance office, facing a nervous Mr. Tegg whose collar seemed to shrink as the inspector's questions expanded. "Your letterhead." "Mr. Tegg," Purbright said mildly, placing the scrap on the desk. "Found among Mrs. Hud's papers this morning. Would you care to explain how it came there?" Tegg's face brightened, then collapsed.
Yes, well, I might have left it during my visit last week."
"She asked me to go over some details regarding the payout." "Perfectly proper, I assure you. Indeed. And what sort of details require late-night discussion?" "Late?" Purbright's gaze was patient, but unwavering. "Miss Teatime, you may recall, has a reliable watch." Tegg reddened.
"We merely dined together. She was—"
"Distressed, naturally. I'm sure she was," said Purbright.
"And now she's been distressed again by a burglary."
"Fortunate coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Tegg floundered.
"You can't think Good heavens, Inspector, why would I?"
Purbright regarded him for a moment longer, then smiled. "I don't think, Mr. Tegg. I prefer to observe. Thinking so often ruins good evidence." When he returned to the station, the evening sun had begun to sink, staining the damp cobbles a dull red.
Love looked up from his notes.
"We've had another report, sir."
"A note left in the church porch. Anonymous," he handed it over.
The paper was cheap, the handwriting awkwardly disguised. She'll join him soon. Purbright read it twice, expression unreadable.
Charming, he said at last.
You see, love, Flaxborough never tires of a tragedy. It simply changes the author. You think it's a prank?
Perhaps, or a warning.
In either case, it tells us one thing clearly. Someone wants this matter reopened, even if it has to be theatrically. He pocketed the note and walked to the window. Outside, the lamps were flickering to life again, their reflections trembling in the puddles. Somewhere beyond the square, church bells tolled softly for evening service. "Sir?" Love prompted. Purbright spoke without turning. "Whoever broke into that house wasn't looking for jewellery, love. They were looking for paper."
For evidence. Evidence of what?
Purbright smiled faintly. "That's the part they didn't find. Which makes me suspect it still exists, in that Mrs. Hudd, practical woman that she is, knows exactly where." He turned away from the window and reached for his coat. "Keep an eye on her tonight. Quietly, I expect we'll hear another sound from Mulberry Lane before long." As he left, the faintest breeze stirred through the open window. On his desk, the anonymous note fluttered once, then stilled, as if the paper itself had sighed in agreement. The following morning dawned washed clean, a faint mist drifting above the river, and the church bells still murmuring their way through early service. Flaxborough, always so pleased with its peace, looked once more like a place incapable of malice. Inspector Purbright, who knew better, walked through the empty market square with his hands in his coat pockets and an expression of mild thoughtfulness, as though the weather had said something worth considering. He found his way to the small tea room near the post office, ordered a pot of weak tea and a slice of toast, and sat by the window, watching the shopkeepers lift shutters and sweep thresholds. It was the hour of the day when people prepared to be respectable. Purbright watched it all with a quiet detachment that might have been called fondness if one were generous. There was a certain rhythm to human deceit, he reflected. Not grand deceit, the sort that filled courtrooms and newspapers, but the modest, daily kind that thrived in towns like Flaxborough. Here people lied to preserve comfort, not profit, to protect dignity, not power, yet comfort, like paint, could conceal corrosion. The widow Hudd was a perfect example. He had no proof, not yet, but every instinct told him she had learned to use the town's politeness as camouflage. Her grief had been performed precisely to its audience's taste, subdued, economical, faintly admirable. It was the sort of grief that didn't inconvenience anyone. And that, Purbright thought, was the most suspicious thing of all. He stirred his tea absently. The break-in, the anonymous note, the missing papers, all the untidy human edges that followed a supposedly tidy death. He suspected the burglary had been less about theft and more about panic. Someone, perhaps the same someone who had thought themselves safe, now feared discovery. It was rarely the clever who panicked, he mused. It was those who realized too late that their cleverness had been misunderstood. A movement outside caught his eye. Mrs. Hudd, crossing Market Hill with deliberate grace, her gloved hand holding a letter she was posting into the red box. She looked immaculate as ever, the very embodiment of self-control. When she turned, her eyes caught his through the window for the briefest moment. And in that flicker, Purbright saw neither guilt nor fear, but calculation. It was not the look of someone hiding a crime, but of someone managing it. When she was gone, he sat for a long time in thought, tracing the condensation on his teacup with one finger. The trouble with Flaxborough, he reflected, was that people here still believed wickedness wore an expression. They expected guilt to look like guilt. But in truth, wickedness preferred good tailoring and impeccable manners. He rose, left a coin on the saucer, and walked back toward the station. On his way, he passed Miss Teatime, who greeted him with the air of a woman professionally acquainted with intrigue. "Good morning, Inspector," she said brightly. "You do look thoughtful. Not, I hope, about anything as tiresome as crime." "Always, Miss Teatime." Crime is Flaxborough's quietest industry, she smiled. Then I trust business is brisk? He inclined his head. Brisk enough. Inside the station, Sergeant Love was bent over the typewriter, producing what sounded like a very long report on very little. He looked up quickly. Morning, sir. Nothing new overnight, except Mrs. Cringe swears she saw someone near the church porch again. Probably the same person who left that note. Or the same imagination that wrote it, Purbright replied, removing his hat. Still, we'll not dismiss her. Imagination has solved more crimes than facts have. He sat at his desk and took out his notebook. Across several pages, his own handwriting sprawled in precise, calm lines: solvent, Hinge, insurance, Granby, Tegg. Beneath them,
a new note. The gate, paint too new, widow too calm. He gazed at the words for a long moment.
What troubled him most wasn't the deceit itself, but the elegance of it.
Every piece fit, and yet it fit too perfectly.
There was no randomness, no human error, and that was unnatural. Guilt, in his experience, was rarely neat. Love, watching him, ventured, "You think the widow staged the burglary herself?" Purbright looked up, smiling faintly.
An interesting notion, Love, but staging requires audience.
I'm beginning to think she didn't want us to believe she'd been burgled. She wanted us to notice she hadn't been robbed of anything worth stealing. Love frowned.
You mean she wanted to seem innocent? Not innocent, irrelevant.
The most convenient thing a guilty person can be is unimportant. He rose and walked to the window. Outside, the river shimmered weakly in the morning sun, its surface deceptive in its stillness.
Do you ever wonder, Love, he said after a moment, why so many crimes in small towns have to do with pride, not passion?
People here don't kill for love or money. They kill because someone else reminded them they were ordinary. Love blinked, uncertain whether this was philosophy or procedure. I suppose that's true, sir. Purbright turned back to him, his tone gentle. Keep an eye on Mr. Tegg. I suspect our widow's composure has found itself a business partner. When Love left, the inspector remained by the window, watching the square below come fully to life. Carriages clattering, a baker's boy hurrying across the cobbles, Mrs. Cringe emerging from her gate to exchange her latest revelation with whoever was nearest. The rhythm of the town was the same as ever, polite and self-satisfied, yet beneath it ran a faint current of unease. Purbright could almost feel it, that fragile moment when a lie begins to crack, and everyone pretends not to hear the sound. He thought again of the faint green smear beneath the iron hinge, the unconvincing burglary, and the empty safe. None of these things alone were proof of guilt, but together they whispered a story, quiet and consistent, in a language Purbright knew well. He sat again and lit his pipe, letting the smoke drift upward. Human nature, he murmured to himself, is a mechanism too easily adjusted and too rarely tested. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour, each note carrying through the mist like a reminder. He listened until it faded, then smiled, the slow, thoughtful smile of a man who had begun to see the outline of something clear and inconvenient. Beneath the paintwork of civility, Monday brought with it the kind of brittle sunshine that made even the most unremarkable parts of Flaxborough appear faintly self-satisfied. Inspector Purbright, having watched the town resume its routine dignity, decided it was time to disturb it again, though politely, as was his habit. His reflections of the previous day had congealed into purpose. The time for observation was ending. The time for confirmation had arrived. He telephoned Mrs. Hudd that morning, his tone mild and conversational. "Mrs. Hudd, I hope I'm not intruding upon your day. I was wondering if I might trouble you for a few minutes this afternoon, just to clarify a few small details before I close the file." Her voice came back bright and composed. "Of course, Inspector. I'll be home after 3, though I do wish these poor details would stop troubling you." Purbright smiled faintly. "So do I, madam. But details are like flies. They settle precisely where they're not wanted." He arrived at 3:30, punctual without appearing eager. The widow received him in the sitting room, where everything, from the flowers to the cushions, seemed freshly adjusted for inspection. She wore black still, but a softer black, the sort that flatters more than mourns. "Tea?" she offered, already pouring. "Thank you."
No sugar. They sat facing one another across a low table, the sunlight cutting through lace curtains and landing neatly upon the silver tray.
The quiet between them was polite but weighted. Two minds in genteel combat, each determined to appear unaware of the other's strategy. "I understand the insurance matter has been concluded," Purbright began casually. "Almost. Mr. Tegg assures me the final forms are ready." "A capable man, Mr. Tegg," she smiled faintly. "Efficient, yes, though I do wish people would stop talking about him. It seems one can't have a conversation in Flaxborough without becoming a headline." "Flaxborough," said Purbright, "was built upon the sound of other people's voices. Silence here is considered unnatural." She laughed softly, though the amusement didn't reach her eyes. He sipped his tea and let the pause lengthen. Then, in the same mild tone, he said, "You know, Mrs. Hudd, I've been thinking about that gate again." Her expression did not change, but her hand tightened slightly on the teacup. "Oh, yes. You see, our constable happened to notice the paint on the lower hinge hadn't quite dried, even several days after the inquest.
Odd that.
Paint usually hardens quickly, unless mixed with the wrong solvent, the sort used to strip metal, for instance." The pause that followed was barely perceptible, but in it Purbright heard the faint click of calculation. "I wouldn't know about such things," she said lightly. "Arthur handled all the painting." "Of course," Purbright murmured. "Though I believe you purchased the solvent yourself, didn't you? A week before the accident." Her composure faltered, just slightly. "Oh, yes, for cleaning, not for anything else. I've always liked things to shine." "And yet," he continued, still perfectly mild, "the solvent you chose does rather more than clean. It eats iron from within. Harmless enough at first glance until a hinge, say, a gate hinge, loses its strength." For a moment, she said nothing. The room seemed to still around the sound of the clock on the mantel, ticking with unhelpful regularity. Then she laughed again, carefully, as if at a child's joke. "Inspector, are you suggesting I somehow—"
Engineered my husband's accident?
Purbright looked faintly apologetic. "I never suggest, Mrs. Hudd. I only observe."
And I observed at the Historical Society luncheon that you told an amusing story about your late husband's principles dropping on him. It was the sort of remark that lingers. Her smile cooled.
"You're reading far too much into a figure of speech." "Possibly. I tend to read slowly. It helps with the small print." She rose then, moving to adjust the vase on the mantel. "Inspector, I do hope this isn't official business. I'd hate to think I'm under suspicion for having poor taste in anecdotes." "Nothing official," Purbright assured her. "Just curiosity. Though curiosity, as you know, is the small engine that moves larger things." He rose as well, preparing to leave.
One last matter.
"When the blacksmith rehung your gate, he mentioned the lower hinge looked unusually smooth, as though someone had sanded it recently. Did you perhaps have it polished before the accident?" Her eyes flicked to him, sharp, defensive, then immediately serene. "No, Inspector. I'm sure you're mistaken." "I dare say I am," he said pleasantly, setting down his cup.
I often am, until I'm not. He inclined his head, thanked her for the tea, and made his way to the door.
As he reached for his hat, she spoke, her tone polite but edged. "You have quite an imagination, Inspector. I hope it serves you better than it served my husband." He paused, just long enough to look back.
Imagination, Mrs. Hudd, is like ironwork.
"It's strongest when forged under pressure," she didn't reply. The door closed behind him with a soft, decisive sound, a sound that told him she had heard more than he had said. Outside, the afternoon light had softened into gold. Purbright walked slowly toward the square, his expression unreadable, his mind turning over every flicker, every hesitation she had betrayed. He felt no satisfaction, only the quiet confirmation that comes when instinct finally aligns with evidence. As he crossed Market Hill, Mrs. Cringe appeared, fluttering toward him like an eager note in human form.
"Inspector!"
"You've been to see her again, haven't you?"
"Such bravery."
"I wouldn't drink tea in that house for all the silver in her cupboard." Purbright smiled faintly. "I find tea everywhere tastes the same, Mrs. Cringe. It's only the company that changes the flavour." He left her standing in mild confusion and continued on, his thoughts steady. The test had worked, not through words, but through silence. The guilty always betrayed themselves not by what they confessed, but by what they tried too hard to disguise. That evening, as the lamps flickered to life and the church bell marked the hour, Purbright sat alone in his office, the day's report unopened before him. Outside, the faint wind carried the sound of the blacksmith's hammer echoing from afar. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. He listened to it with quiet satisfaction. It was a sound he knew well, the shaping of metal, yes, but also of truth, tempered, patient, inevitable. By Wednesday afternoon, the air in Flaxborough had turned heavy with that peculiar anticipation which precedes the settling of a long gestating curiosity. Word had already spread, vaguely and inaccurately, that Inspector Purbright was wrapping up the HUD business. Nobody knew what this entailed, but everyone hoped it would include scandal. Even respectability in Flaxborough required occasional refreshment. At the police station, Purbright sat behind his desk, reading a typed report he had no real need to read. His attention was elsewhere, on the sound of footsteps approaching along the corridor. The measured rhythm belonged unmistakably to Mrs. Hudd. She entered, composed as ever, a dark hat casting a modest shadow across her calm features. "Inspector," she said with courteous brightness, "you wish to see me?" "Indeed, Mrs. Hudd. Please sit." She did so, setting her gloves neatly upon the table. There was a faint scent of lilac about her, discreet and deliberate. Purbright regarded her with the same mild interest one might extend to an elegant clock whose ticking had grown suspiciously irregular. "I'll keep this brief," he said pleasantly. "You'll be glad to know I've nearly concluded my report for the coroner's office. But before I close the file, there's one small inconsistency I'd appreciate your help with." Her expression remained still, but her shoulders drew slightly inward. "Oh, I thought everything had been explained." "Almost everything," said Purbright. "The gate, for instance. I've learned it was built with a unique adjustable hinge, an invention of your late husband's. Rather clever. Designed to swing both ways and lock at different angles. His old business partner, Mr. Granby, confirmed it. How industrious of him," she said lightly. "Yes," Purbright agreed, "and yet that same hinge failed. Curiously, it was the lower one, the one that had been sanded smooth, treated with solvent, and repainted shortly before the accident." "I told you," she began, but he raised a hand gently. "Quite so. You told me Arthur handled all the painting, and yet every piece of evidence suggests otherwise. The brush strokes, the shade of paint, the faint residue of the solvent you bought, all point to a far more patient hand than his. You see, Mr. Hudd painted quickly and unevenly. The blacksmith remembers the drips. Yours, however, were careful, deliberate." Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again.
"You can't possibly prove that," she said after a moment, her tone low. Purbright smiled, mild as ever.
"Proof, Mrs. Hudd, is a vulgar thing. I prefer demonstration." He stood, walked to the cabinet, and opened a drawer. From it, he removed a small metal hinge, dull, corroded, one side cleanly sheared. "This," he said, setting it before her, "is from the lower joint of your gate. It's been examined. The inner surface shows signs of chemical erosion, most likely from the solvent you purchased. Not enough to melt the metal, but enough to weaken its structure so that with one sharp gust of wind, the hinge would fail."
"Ingenious, really. An accident made to order." Her gaze was fixed on the hinge, unblinking.
When she finally spoke, it was almost a whisper.
"You think I meant to do it?" I think you understood exactly what would happen, Purbright replied softly.
Your husband had a way of making his presence permanent, his voice, his projects, his rules. A house built around him, not with you. You didn't need to kill him in anger, Mrs. Hudd. You only needed him to let go. The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, a cart rumbled faintly along the street, the sound receding like an afterthought. She lifted her chin slowly, composure returning in measured increments. You make it sound very poetic, Inspector. But you forget one thing. I gained nothing. The insurance money isn't even paid yet. Purbright regarded her with calm patience. You underestimate the value of freedom, Mrs. Hudd. You were already rich in a manner of speaking. You simply couldn't spend it while he was alive. A flicker passed through her eyes. Annoyance, faint but visible. If you intend to accuse me formally, then do so.
Otherwise, I see no reason to sit here while you accuse.
Purbright interrupted gently.
Oh, no, madam. I don't accuse.
The evidence is too subtle, and the town too fond of its tidy explanations. Officially, your husband died by misadventure.
My report will not say otherwise.
But unofficially, well, Flaxborough will decide what to believe. It always does. For the first time she seemed uncertain. Then why summon me? Because I wanted you to hear it said, he replied quietly.
Not for the record, but for yourself.
So that when you walk past that gate each morning, you'll know what it remembers. Something within her composure cracked then, not visibly, not in her posture or her voice, but in the silence that followed. Her gaze dropped to the hinge, to the small scar of rust along its edge. When she finally looked up again, her smile was faint and colourless. You're a cruel man, Inspector. No, he said, almost kindly. Merely observant, she stood, gathering her gloves. Will that be all? For now, though you may wish to speak with Mr. Tegg. He seems rather nervous about his correspondence with you. I imagine he'll find Bournemouth less appealing once the gossip begins. Her eyes narrowed slightly.
So that's your punishment? Rumour?
In Flaxborough, Purbright said. It's the only one that always fits the crime. She left without another word. The door closed softly, and the faint scent of lilac lingered in her absence. Purbright remained seated for a while, looking at the hinge gleaming dully on his desk. He felt no triumph, only the calm melancholy of resolution. Cases like this never ended cleanly. They merely faded into the fabric of the town, absorbed by its appetite for story. At last he stood, replaced the hinge in its envelope, and crossed to the window. The street outside was ordinary again, bakers, bicycles, and gossip on the move. He thought of the widow walking through it, smiling faintly at the neighbours who would soon whisper her name with equal parts pity and fascination. Justice, he murmured, is a very domestic thing here. It always comes with tea. He closed the curtain against the afternoon light, then turned back to his desk, where the report awaited completion. His pen hovered for a moment before writing the only words that truly mattered. Case concluded. By the end of the week, Flaxborough had already begun to reshape the story into something it could live with. The widow's calm acceptance of her husband's death was now, depending on who told it, either a triumph of courage or proof of unnatural coldness. There was no longer talk of the accident itself, only of what it revealed, about marriage, about fate, about the curious way some people seemed to emerge from tragedy slightly improved. Mrs. Cringe, naturally, had taken it upon herself to provide what she called closure. She had stood by the gate on Mulberry Lane the morning after Mrs. Hudd's final visit to the police station, announcing to Miss Mounts that she had never seen a woman carry herself so well under suspicion. By evening, the comment had evolved into, "Clarice Hudd, poor dear, was entirely cleared."
Of course, but she's not been the same since that inspector questioned her. Mrs. Hudd herself appeared only briefly in public.
On Friday afternoon, she was seen leaving the insurance office in a dark travelling coat, her luggage sent ahead by cab. She told Mr. Tegg, who hovered anxiously in the doorway, that she intended to visit relatives in the south for rest and reflection. The word reflection was repeated with great satisfaction throughout the town, as if it confirmed something moral about the entire episode. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, spent that morning in his office, finishing the last of the paperwork. The formal report was written with his usual precision and absence of flourish. No evidence of foul play, it read, though circumstances remain of interest. He signed it, dated it, and set it neatly on the pile for the coroner's clerk. Then for a long time he simply sat, watching the sunlight drift across the wooden floor, his thoughts turning not toward justice or guilt, but toward the quieter consequences of both. Sergeant Love entered with the day's correspondence. Letter from County HQ, sir. And one from the BBC. Someone wants to interview you about that burglary last spring. Decline politely, Purbright said without looking up. Yes, sir.
Anything else?
Yes, close the file on the HUD case, but keep the photographs.
I've found the past tends to recycle itself here. Love hesitated. You think she did it, then?
Purbright gave a small, unreadable smile. She did something, Love. What exactly it was depends on how you define harm. A gate fell, a man died, and a woman learned the difference between solitude and freedom. Whether that's a crime is best left to philosophers and gossip. Love nodded, though he plainly preferred simpler conclusions. Well, at least it's over. Over? Purbright repeated softly as though testing the word. Yes, perhaps. That afternoon he took his habitual walk through the town. The season had begun to turn. There was a mildness in the air that hinted at spring's slow approach. In the marketplace the stalls were crowded again with the familiar ordinariness of apples, onions, and opinion. Purbright greeted the traders as he passed, nodding to the vicar, pausing briefly to admire a display of daffodils. Nothing outwardly
had changed, and yet, as he looked around,
he sensed the faint shift that always followed revelation. People stood a little closer when speaking, looked over their shoulders a little more often. Knowledge, once acquired, was never entirely comfortable. He paused at the corner by the ironmonger's shop. The same solvent still occupied its shelf, the label bright and inviting. He studied it for a moment, then smiled faintly and moved on. The world, he thought, had a curious way of advertising its temptations openly, while pretending they were secrets. As he reached Mulberry Lane, the widow's house came into view. It was shuttered now, its garden unkempt, the once proud gate leaning slightly inward as though exhausted by all it had witnessed. The fresh paint had dulled to a flat, lifeless green.
A stray scrap of paper fluttered against the hedge, perhaps an old letter, perhaps nothing at all.
He picked it up absently, then let it go again, watching it drift away on the breeze. From across the street, Mrs. Cringe emerged, inevitably, her curiosity thinly disguised as housekeeping. Good afternoon, Inspector.
I suppose everything's sorted now.
Poor dear Clarice off to Bournemouth, they say. Quite so, Purbright said mildly. A change of air can be most restorative, indeed. Though between you and me, I do wonder if she'll ever come back. People say she never could stand the winters here, Purbright smiled. Flaxborough winters are difficult for anyone with an appreciation of warmth. He tipped his hat and continued down the street. Behind him, Mrs. Cringe stood, watching the retreating figure of the inspector with an expression of mingled admiration and disappointment, the admiration of one who respected thoroughness, and the disappointment of one who found finality an anticlimax. Back at the station, twilight had begun to settle. The lamplighter's pole gleamed faintly as he moved along the row outside, coaxing small circles of light into being. Purbright sat at his desk again, filling his pipe. The faint rasp of the match echoed softly in the quiet office. He thought of Mrs. Hudd, of the look in her eyes as she had stood before him 2 days earlier. Not fear, not guilt exactly, but something deeper, like the expression of a person who had survived her own conscience and found it less frightening than expected. He wondered how long she would manage that comfort, before the silence of her own freedom began to press in. The clock on the wall ticked, steady and deliberate. Love reappeared at the door. "You're going home, sir?" "In a while," said Purbright. "There's always another file to open." "About what this time?" Purbright glanced toward the stack of reports awaiting him.
"Something involving the allotments, I believe. An irregularity with the cucumbers."
"Crime, love is simply horticulture with poor excuses." The sergeant grinned, nodded, and left him to it. For a few minutes more, Purbright sat alone, gazing through the window at the slow flicker of lamplight against the cobbles. Somewhere in the distance, a gate creaked faintly in the evening wind, perhaps the one on Mulberry Lane, or perhaps only memory insisting on being heard again. He smiled to himself, a small, weary smile, and began writing the heading of a new report.